Welcome to Infinite Universe with interesting episode. The Mississippi Delta looked bright, almost like a shining piece of art. That's how it's often described, especially in songs that celebrate American music. But this story doesn't start there. It begins in 1953, in Queens, New York, where two young boys met at a school talent show. They were both just kids, but that meeting would go on to shape the future of American music in a way no one could have imagined. Those boys were Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. At first, it seemed like a perfect friendship. They were just 11 years old, full of dreams, ideas, and excitement. But by 1970, they had become the most famous music duo in the world. People everywhere were singing their songs. Their voices blended so perfectly it was like magic. But behind the music, something else was going on, something painful and hard to explain. One of them said something so hurtful that it created a wound that never really healed. It wasn't about money or music. It was personal, and it broke their bond. For the next 10 years, even though they performed together and sang in perfect harmony, they would not speak to each other backstage. Their friendship was shattered, but their career forced them to keep going. One of them went so far as to secretly record 30 solo songs without telling the other. The other responded by removing vocals from tracks without asking. It was a silent war between two people who once thought they'd be friends forever. In 2015, the bitterness reached a peak when one of them called the other a monster in a printed interview. That was the final blow. They didn't speak for the next 9 years. The story of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel isn't just about music. It's about friendship, betrayal, ego, ambition, and heartbreak. Paul Simon was born on October 13, 1941, in Newark, New Jersey. His family had Hungarian Jewish roots. His mother, Belle, worked as an elementary school teacher, and his father, Louis, lived a very unique life. By day, Louis was a college professor. But by night, he transformed into a musician, playing bass in dance bands. He even used a stage name, Lee Sims. Their house was filled with both books and music. Paul grew up surrounded by learning, tradition, and a deep love for rhythm. His mom made sure he stayed connected to their Jewish roots, taking him to synagogue, while his dad took him to Yankee Stadium. Watching baseball legends like Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio wasn't just about sports, it was about seeing heroes in action. Later in life, Paul would even write about DiMaggio in the song Mrs. Robinson. Donald Fagen, another well-known musician, once said Paul was the perfect example of a New York Jewish kid who loved two things deeply, music and baseball. These two passions helped children of immigrants feel like they belonged in America. In 1945, when Paul was 4 years old, his family moved to a neighborhood in Queens called Kew Gardens Hills. That move changed everything. It wasn't just a new house, it was a new way of life. At night, the family would stay up late to watch Louis perform on TV shows like The Jackie Gleason Show and Arthur Godfrey and His Friends. Paul saw how quickly his father could go from teacher to performer. That left a deep impression. Music, he realized, wasn't just a hobby, it could be an identity, a career, a way to shine. Their new neighborhood was filled with Jewish families who loved music and valued education. Paul absorbed everything around him. He discovered jazz, folk singers like Woody Guthrie, and the raw, emotional blues of Lead Belly. All of it shaped how he viewed life and music. Then, in 1953, during a talent show at Public School 164, Paul saw a boy his age sing alone on stage. That boy was Art Garfunkel. A girl nearby whispered how amazing he was, and that moment changed Paul forever. He wasn't just interested in music anymore, he wanted to be admired, especially by girls. He realized that singing wasn't just about sound, it was about making people notice you. Later that same year, the two boys met again during their 6th grade graduation play, a performance of Alice in Wonderland. It was just a school play, but for Paul and Art, it felt like something much bigger. Their voices blended so well that they decided to form a doo-wop group called the Peptones. They performed at school dances and neighborhood parties. Paul also began writing songs. By the time he was 13, he had written their first original song. At 15, they had gone from classmates to recording artists. In 1957, using the stage names Tom and Jerry, They recorded a song called Hey Schoolgirl. They were trying to remember the lyrics to a song called Hey Doll Baby when they accidentally wrote their own. They scraped together $25 to record a demo, which was a lot of money for kids back then. But it paid off. A music promoter named Sid Prosen heard the song and decided to sign them. Paul took the name Jerry Landis, and Art became Tom Graff. Their song reached number 49 on the Billboard charts and sold over 100,000 copies. They even appeared on American Bandstand. At just 15 years old, they were suddenly famous. But even then, trouble was beginning to grow between them. Paul wasn't just a singer, he was a songwriter, too. He had written their very first song, The Girl for Me, when he was just 12 or 13. His dad had written out the lyrics and chords, and that original paper now sits in the Library of Congress. Art had the more beautiful voice, but Paul had the talent for writing and the ambition to go further. That imbalance, Paul creating and Art performing, was there from the beginning. And over time, it would only get worse. Between 1957 and 1964, Paul led a double life. While still working with Art, he also recorded more than 30 songs under fake names like Jerry Landis, Paul Kane, and True Taylor. He didn't do it for fun, he was serious. He was quietly building a solo career without telling Art. He recorded his own songs and even wrote and produced music for other artists. By 1962, he was working for a label called Amy Records, creating music for groups like Dewey Daniels, The Vells, and Richie Cordell. His first solo single as True Taylor came out in 1958. That meant just a few months after their first big hit, Paul was already planning a career without Art. The worst part was that Sid Prosen, the promoter who signed them, offered Paul solo deals behind ART's back. Paul never said a word about it. Art found out later and felt completely betrayed. He said that betrayal shattered their friendship, and he never truly forgave Paul for it. While Art still believed in their duo, Paul was already looking for a way out. That hurt even more because their career as Tom and Jerry was starting to fade. They couldn't recreate their first big success. Instead of waiting, Paul moved on without telling Art. By the time Art realized what was happening, it was already too late. Paul's growing success made things worse. In 1962, he joined a group called Tico and the Triumphs and released a song called Motorcycle. It reached number 99 on the Billboard chart. Around the same time, he released The Lone Teen Ranger under the name Jerry Landis, which reached number 97. These may not have been huge hits, but they proved that Paul didn't need Art to succeed. He had learned how to do it on his own. Paul's secret work with Tico and the Triumphs also showed something important, his ability to control things from behind the scenes. Although another singer, Marty Cooper, was the group's frontman, it was Paul who sang lead vocals on the song that charted. He was quietly pulling the strings. He had a plan and was already replacing Art without saying a word. In 1958, they quietly split. It wasn't a dramatic breakup. They simply drifted apart. But the damage was deep. They didn't talk again until 1963, 5 years later. In that time, Paul had released over 30 songs under different names. Art tried to make music, too, but without Paul's drive and connections, he didn't get very far. When they did reunite in 1963, it wasn't because they missed each other. It was because they had both hit rock bottom. Paul was struggling. He worked for a music publisher and made cold calls to record labels, trying to sell songs. One of his songs, He Was My Brother, caught the attention of a producer named Tom Wilson at Columbia Records. But Wilson didn't want Paul, he wanted to give the song to a British group. Paul, thinking fast, convinced Wilson to let him and Art audition one song together. They chose to perform The Sound of Silence. Tom Wilson had worked with jazz legends like Miles Davis. He had high standards. But he was blown away by Paul's poetic lyrics and ART's pure voice. That one audition changed everything. Columbia gave them a contract. For the first time, they used their real names, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. But even then, success didn't come easy. Their debut album, Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., was released in October 1964, and it was a complete failure. It sold just 1,000 copies in 8 months. The folk music style they used had already become old-fashioned. The Beatles had changed music overnight, and Columbia tried to market Paul and Art as part of the older folk generation. It didn't work. The album got bad reviews and poor sales. They split again. Paul went to England, where he performed in tiny clubs and recorded a solo album called the Paul Simon Songbook. Art stayed in New York and went back to school at Columbia University. They had no idea that the songs Paul wrote during his time alone in England would later become some of their biggest hits. Then, something unexpected happened. In 1965, without telling Paul or Art, producer Tom Wilson added electric guitar and drums to the sound of silence. He had just finished working with Bob Dylan on Like a Rolling Stone and decided to try the same idea. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't even tell them. He just released the new version. And somehow, it worked. The remixed version started playing on radio stations in Boston and Florida. Paul only found out when he saw it mentioned in Billboard magazine while he was performing in Denmark. On January 1, 1966, The Sound of Silence hit #1 in America. Paul was shocked. Art called him to celebrate, but Paul didn't like the changes to the rhythm and tempo. Still, the song was a hit. They rushed back to the US to record another album and take advantage of their sudden success. But something had changed. Paul wanted full control. While recording their new album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme, Paul took charge of everything. He directed the instruments, oversaw the sound, and spent endless hours in the studio. Many of the songs were based on material he had written during his time in England. Art mostly just showed up to sing. That was all Paul allowed. But the album became a massive success. It reached #4 on the Billboard chart and sold millions of copies. It seemed like everything was perfect again. But in reality, the wounds between them had never healed and more pain was still to come. When Simon and Garfunkel began making music together, their friendship seemed unbreakable. But with time and success, things began to fall apart. Paul Simon started to feel like he was the true creative force behind their music, while Art Garfunkel was simply the voice. This imbalance of recognition grew worse over time. When their music was featured in the film The Graduate in 1967, they became huge stars. Their song Mrs. Robinson wasn't even fully finished when the film was released, but it still became a hit. The soundtrack topped the charts, and their next album, Bookends, stayed at #1 for 16 weeks. They won Record of the Year at the Grammys, and their popularity skyrocketed. However, behind the scenes, Paul was becoming increasingly upset. He noticed that fans often gave Art too much credit. Many believed Art wrote the songs, while in reality, Paul was the songwriter. The duo's manager once said that each man envied the other. Paul was also personally insecure. Art was taller, more photogenic, and once joked, "I'll always be taller than you." That small comment stuck with Paul for decades and became a source of quiet pain. The breaking point came with the film Catch-22. The director offered both of them acting roles, but Paul's part was later removed. Only Art remained in the movie. Paul was humiliated. Art left for Mexico to shoot the film, while Paul stayed in New York. Their album Bridge Over Troubled Water had to be recorded in 2 long and separated sessions. One in 1968, and the other a full year later. Paul waited alone, feeling abandoned. When he tried to keep things going creatively, Art only wanted him to send demo tapes across the border. Art would listen and then call back with feedback. Paul found this process deeply upsetting. He had always believed in working side by side, not being treated like an employee. Eventually, Art told Paul, "Here's how it'll be. I'll make movies for 6 months, then come back, and you'll have written the songs." Paul's answer was short and final. No, that one word ended the partnership. It wasn't just a rejection of ART's plan, it was a rejection of the entire idea of continuing their musical relationship. Paul had been the one writing and arranging everything, but Art was getting the loudest applause. Every time Art sang Bridge Over Troubled Water live, the crowd roared while Paul stood in the background, quietly hurting. The final recording sessions for that album were lonely. Paul worked with the band and producer while Art was away. Even the instruments for the title track were recorded far away in California, just to make it easier for ART's travel schedule. When it came time to sing, Art performed it alone and received standing ovations. The album became their biggest success and their last one together. They split up in 1970. Many believed Paul would bounce back easily, especially with their final album still topping charts. But deep down, he was filled with fear and self-doubt. In 1972, Paul released his first solo album. It was simply titled Paul Simon. One song, Mother and Child Reunion, had an unusual origin. It was inspired by a dish on a menu. But the music was groundbreaking. Paul traveled to Jamaica to record reggae with Jimmy Cliff's band. It worked. The song became a hit in both the US and the UK. Another track, Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, was a storytelling song that also became a hit. The album climbed the charts in the US, UK, and Japan. In 1973, Paul released There Goes Rimmin' Simon. His confidence was growing, and he started to experiment with different musical styles. One single, Kodachrome, used photography as a clever metaphor for memory and reached number 2 on the charts. Another song, Loves Me Like a Rock, topped the Cashbox chart and featured gospel vocals from the Dixie Hummingbirds. Then came American Tune, a song that touched people emotionally, even though it wasn't a big chart hit. The melody was borrowed from Bach and reflected the sadness of post-Vietnam America. 2 years later, in 1975, Paul released Still Crazy After All These Years. This was his most emotional work yet. He had recently divorced his wife Peggy Harper, and the songs reflected that heartbreak. Despite the sadness, the album was a massive success. It won Album of the Year at the Grammys, and Paul was named Best Male Pop Vocalist. The most famous track, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, stayed at number 1 for 3 weeks in 1976. That same album included My Little Town, a reunion song with Art that made it to number 9 on the charts. But Paul's personal life remained messy. In 1983, he married actress Carrie Fisher, known worldwide for playing Princess Leia. Their relationship was intense and fast-moving. They met during the height of the Star Wars craze and quickly fell for each other. But getting married during a reunion tour with Art turned out to be a disaster. Paul would later say in a 2024 documentary that the marriage was exhausting. Carrie lived in the spotlight and understood fame in a way Paul never did. She loved the attention, while Paul felt suffocated by it. They lasted only 11 months as a married couple. Still, their time together left a deep impact. They were both at high points in their careers, but the relationship felt like a storm. Paul later admitted that her addiction issues, mood swings, and love of fame drained him. That emotional stress poured into Paul's 1983 album Hearts and Bones. Though critics praised it, the album didn't sell well. It was raw and honest, but audiences didn't connect with it at the time. The wealth and fame made things worse. Their life was full of luxury, private jets, fancy hotels, constant media attention. Paul felt like he was stuck in a role he didn't want to play. After their split, he eventually remarried Edie Brickell in 1992. They lived a quieter life and raised 3 children. Paul avoided the spotlight after that. But the controversies weren't over. In 1985, Paul traveled to South Africa during the apartheid era, defying a global boycott led by the United Nations. He went there to record music with local musicians. Though he paid them well, $200 an hour compared to the local rate of $15 a day, many activists were furious. They believed Paul was helping the apartheid regime just by being there. Protests followed him during his tour. Many musicians condemned him. Then came another scandal. Steve Berlin of Los Lobos accused Paul of stealing one of their songs. According to Berlin, Paul had no song ready when they started jamming in the studio. Later, Paul included the track on Graceland without crediting Los Lobos. When they confronted him, Berlin claimed Paul told them to sue me. Paul denied this, but the damage was done. Other musicians also claimed they weren't properly credited or paid. South African jazz legend Jonas Gwangwa criticized Paul for needing a white artist to make African music famous. Paul insisted the music was the protest itself. He didn't write political lyrics because he believed the act of collaboration was the message. Still, his decision led to backlash. He was blacklisted by the United Nations and the ANC. In 1987, his name was eventually cleared, but the tension lingered for years. Even decades later, artists like Billy Bragg still protested his appearances. In the middle of all this, Paul and Art crossed paths again in 1975 while working with John Lennon. The encounter felt warm, like old times. They decided to work together again and spent months in the studio. But they only managed to finish one song, My Little Town. It ended up on both of their solo albums, not a joint one, showing how divided they still were. In 1981, they performed a historic concert in Central Park for over 500,000 people. It was a magical night and seemed like a perfect reunion. The concert aired on HBO and the live album went double platinum. But behind the scenes, their relationship was falling apart again. A world tour followed, and instead of bringing them closer, it pushed them further apart. They stopped talking completely. They sang in harmony on stage, but offstage, they were distant and cold. In 1983, things turned ugly again. They were working on a new album, Think Too Much, and Art recorded several vocals. But Paul changed his mind. He decided the songs were too personal, especially one about Carrie Fisher, and deleted Art's vocals without even telling him. Paul re-recorded everything as a solo album and renamed it Hearts and Bones. Art was devastated. He felt betrayed. That was the final straw. They never made music together again. In 2010, they planned one last reunion tour. But Art developed vocal cord paralysis and couldn't sing. The tour was cancelled. Paul was frustrated, feeling like Art hadn't been honest about his health. Even when Art recovered, Paul had no interest in trying again. In 2015, Art gave a brutal interview where he called Paul a jerk and said their friendship started because he felt sorry for Paul's short height. He even compared Paul to Napoleon. The comments hurt deeply. Paul later said there was no warmth left between them, only finality. By 2018, Paul seemed to be done. He admitted he hadn't written new music in years and felt finished. From 2015 to 2024, he and Art didn't speak at all, not even once. Then, unexpectedly, Art ran into Paul's son Harper in their apartment building, which led to a quiet reunion lunch. Art asked Paul why they hadn't talked in so long. Paul said it was because of that old interview and the hurtful things Art had said. In 2023, Paul released 7 Psalms, a 33-minute acoustic album he called his most personal work. But behind the music was a serious health issue. He had lost nearly all hearing in his left ear after a bad case of COVID-19. Doctors couldn't explain it. He admitted he could no longer sing songs like You Can Call Me Earl. His health was declining, and he felt trapped in a world of silence, physically and emotionally. On CBS Mornings in 2024, he said he felt angry and alone, not just because of his hearing loss, but also because of the broken relationship with Art. They had started out as 2 boys from Queens, filled with dreams and music. They climbed to the top of the world together, but over time, pride, pain, and misunderstanding drove them apart. In the end, the silence between them was louder than any song they ever sang. Thanks for watching. Keep it and stay tuned. Like and subscribe our channel. Have a good day.